Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was groundbreaking in its introduction of really giving a lot of power to the Dungeon Master to make whatever rules adjudications they want. So with all this freedom on the DM's part, why is it that I like to stick to the rules as written? Hi everyone, my name is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. Today we're going to be talking about the rules as written, or the raw, and why I tend to rule my games using the rules already printed in the player's handbook, rather than using a lot of homebrew. This doesn't mean I don't use any homebrew at all. In fact, I'll have a whole separate video about the homebrew rules that I use at my table. However, I do tend to mostly use rules as written, especially the errata from Jeremy Crawford's Sage Advice. Part of the reason that I do tend to use the rules as written has to do with my background as a DM. A few years ago, I was hired by a company called Quester's Way to teach a class called D&D 101 in order to teach new players about Dungeons & Dragons' mechanics. As part of this research, I really combed through the 5th edition player's handbook, and I realized there were a lot of rules that I was taught to play with that don't actually exist in the text. Examples of this include things like natural 1s and natural 20s. I wasn't taught that those were variant rules or optional rules. I always thought they were part of the game. And it turns out that the only time a natural 20 comes up in the player's handbook is during the combat section, where it says that if you make an attack roll and get a nat 20, then you get a critical hit. Part of my research was also viewing interviews with Jeremy Crawford and Mike Merles, other game designers that took part in 5th edition. And really, after hearing their reasons for why they designed the mechanics the way they did, it made it much easier for me as a dungeon master to make clear rulings that my players could understand and remember. So at this point in the class, all of my players had elected to buy the player's handbook themselves. And because I was already using the rules as written and not a whole lot of homebrew, because the class was meant for education rather than gameplay, the player's handbook became a common resource for all of us to use. And what it did was it made it so that my players understood what their choices were in-game, so they could spend more time describing the story of their character rather than pondering and getting hung up on how I would resolve a certain mechanic. Because my players knew how I was going to rule everything, it took a lot of time away from them trying to make a decision, wondering how I would try to resolve something, and it really helped speed up gameplay. I noticed, having played both in games where I ruled rules as written and where I did a lot of homebrew, that games that I tended to DM with rules as written tended to maintain better momentum and better flow through the experience, which freed up my players to get involved more in their role-playing. By contrast, I found that games that had a lot of homebrew ended up confusing players that did their homework and went out of their way to try to figure out, how to rule the game. Even something as simple as changing administering a potion to yourself to a bonus action ended up slowing the game down because players would overthink the action economy. Instead, I train my players to find the rules as written for themselves, so that if they go to play at another table, they have a firm understanding of what's core and what's homebrew. The coolest part is, by having this in-depth understanding of how I rule mechanics and what text I'm referencing in the core rulebook, a lot of my players have decided to become DMs in their own right. And because they have a clear understanding of the rules, they are very confident in their adjudications, which only makes their games better. I find that players that are in games that are forced to remember a lot of homebrew get discouraged from being their own DMs because they find the process overwhelming. And most importantly, if I understand why certain rules were written the way they were in 5th edition's design, it means that when I do implement a homebrew rule, I'm educated on the impact it's going to have on the rules system of 5th edition. This prevents potentially implementing a rule that's going to unbalance the game and create some kind of weird feeling at the table. Most of my homebrew tends to be simple additions to rules that already exist in the player's handbook. I very rarely remove or revise rules that already exist in the system. However, my homebrew is a video for another day. So that's all for today, everybody. I hope you guys have an awesome day. Remember, every subscription means the world to us, and it allows us to keep sharing our world with you. And remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.